The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good morning. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for W&M Environmental, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on how to close a contaminated groundwater site. Our experts for today are W&M's Frank Clark and Clay Schneider. Thanks, guys, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them through the chat on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your question, I will make sure that Frank and Clay sees them, and we will get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available to rewatch on our website tomorrow. I'll go ahead and say tomorrow because usually I say this afternoon, and it never happens. But we'll have the slides also available too. So I will send you an email with the link when they're made available. So let's get started. So get going here. Sorry, guys. So Frank Clark is our project engineer and professional geologist. He has a lot of P's and a lot of G's and a lot of letters after his name, and he's our technical director of W&M. Frank, how long have you been in the environmental consulting business?
I've been amazingly just under 40 years working in this profession, which is kind of stunning when you think about it. But
so you've worked on a lot of contaminated groundwater sites.
I have. Since about 1981, I've been working principally in the environmental field, dealing with all types of sites from phase ones all the way through site remediation, both here in Texas as well as in the Northeast, and for a period of time overseas in the United Kingdom. So I had a lot of experience.
Excellent. And Clay, what about you? Clay is our remediation division manager in North Texas. So you're in charge of all the remediation projects that go on in North Texas. How long have you been in the environmental field?
I've been in this for a little over 15 years. A little over 15 years now. So I'm working on a lot of oil and gas remediation projects as well as dry cleaner type sites.
Okay. So, well, let's just get started. So, who wants to take the first slide? So, is that Frank? Is that you?
Yeah, right. Well, for those listening in, if you are involved in real estate transactions or industrial site closures where you've had environmental investigations completed, you have probably had this moment that you recall when one of your colleagues or your consultant called up and said, "We have some groundwater contamination." It can be a very depressing moment because we all know that groundwater contamination is one of the most challenging issues that we have to deal with in the environmental field. And it happens quite frequently, and in particular in urban areas where we do a lot of our work, we find contamination by a variety of different compounds, in particular volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, petroleum hydrocarbons, and heavy metals. And a large majority of the sites that we look at in urban areas do have some degree of contamination, at least of soil, from these chemicals of concern. If the contamination has migrated into underlying groundwater, which it can through percolation through the soil, leaching, then we have the groundwater contamination, which, as I mentioned, is the most challenging aspect of dealing with these sites. Wanted to give a little primer on the history of groundwater cleanup since I've been there for quite a while. Back in the 1970s and earlier 50s and 60s, as everyone knows, there were very little environmental regulations, and processes and procedures for handling hazardous materials were practically non-existent, and that's what has resulted in some of the issues that we see. Historical releases from past practices when industries or users simply did not know the dangerous nature of some of the chemicals that they were using. Starting in about 1970, when the EPA was formed, the country had a much greater awareness of environmental contamination with sites such as Love Canal and other Superfund sites, which received a lot of press and led to the environmental revolution, so to speak, in terms of coming up with programs to address environmental contamination. That included the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that is a process to manage wastes properly, and then Superfund, which is the big national program that was promulgated in 1980 to deal with the worst of the contaminated sites in the country. The real estate and banking industry got on board in the 1980s and 1990s when they realized that environmental contamination represented a risk to their assets. And so they required environmental site assessments to evaluate properties and determine if there was a potential for groundwater contamination that could affect the value of their property that they were loaning on. Leaking underground storage tanks was probably the most prevalent early type of contamination that happened and was visible because they occurred literally on every other street corner in urban parts of the country. Leaking tanks initially were installed with bare steel in the ground in environments that were conducive to corrosion, resulting in steel corrosion and leaking of gasoline or diesel fuel directly into the ground. And we have many, many cases of these. They are still being found today. Old ghost tanks are discovered on a weekly basis in Texas. And the latest statistics from the US EPA indicates that there are over 500,000 leaking underground tanks reported in the United States through March of this year. It's at a staggering number of leaking tank sites. And Texas has its share. I believe the number in Texas is in excess of 27,000.
Wow. And when you say ghost tanks, you're referring to tanks that nobody really knew about, or explain that a little bit more.
Correct, yeah. Ghost tanks were tanks that were installed possibly in the 40s and 50s when car travel became more prevalent. Everyone operated a tank and saw a way to make money selling fuel, and there was no licensing or no extensive licensing required, so there were fuel tanks pretty much on every street corner. Sometimes we find tanks actually buried in the street, and the little pump island was sitting in the sidewalk. So they are still there. Some of them were never mapped, and so therefore they are only found when construction projects or street reconstruction projects cut through the area.
And that can cause a lot. I mean, you don't know what's there, then, and you're already digging. That means you're probably in construction mode, and that means you have to halt and stop.
It is a real headache and affects construction projects in a significant way.
That could be a whole other webinar right there. How to find a ghost tank.
So in the early days, when we really didn't know what appropriate cleanup standards were, and of course everyone said, well, let's clean everything up till drinking water. That's a noble cause. And so the thing that came to mind was to install systems to collect groundwater, bring it to the surface, treat it to an appropriate level, and discharge it. And these are often called pump and treat systems. And during the 70s and 80s and 90s even, thousands and thousands of these pump and treat systems were installed. And just looking at the schematic, you can see that these systems involve expensive wells, pumps, piping, tanks, reservoirs, knockout systems, electronics, very expensive to install, expensive to operate and monitor. And these went in everywhere. And unfortunately, we found that pump and treat, even though it was good at removing some masses of the contaminants, it was very inefficient at getting down to the cleanup levels that we wanted to, which at that time were drinking water standards. So these systems went in, but over periods of time when we found out that they were like the Roach Motel, they went in, but they never came out. They were just ran and ran and ran, some of them for decades. Some of them are still running, according to the EPA's website. We found that pump and treat was not the most effective way.
So when you find out that the groundwater is contaminated, obviously that's going to come after testing. So phase 2, or just do people come to you and just say, I know my groundwater is contaminated? I mean, how does that process start? Like if somebody's listening right now going, I know, and they're scared to death to even do anything about it because, it might go away if they just ignore it.
Right.
So what would the process be?
Well, it's typically happens when a site investigation is required, generally by a lender. Lenders and purchasers are big drivers for conducting site investigations. And the state now has some developed standards for what the expectations are when you initiate a site investigation. And if there's an expectation that you could have contamination of groundwater, you're really forced to look into it. And so that initiates a lot of this, and that's when these groundwater contamination issues are discovered.
So I'm sure that's pretty stressful for somebody that's coming in and saying, hey, but it's not the end of the world. I mean, it's not great. I mean, nobody's going to want to say, yeah, I got contaminated groundwater, but there are solutions. There are a lot of solutions. We're going to get into more of those.
Right.
But
I think that's what we're hoping with this webinar, to go through some of the more traditional solutions. What I wanted to show what has historically worked and not worked. Then we'll talk about some of the things that we can do here in Texas that are successful. And then we'll talk about what we think is the best tool for dealing with contaminated groundwater, which is municipal setting designations.
Okay, great.
So we're not going to dwell on historical activities much, but I think it's interesting just to see what has been done. This is a technology that is still very actively used on many sites today. It's some type of what we call in situ, which is Latin for in place treatment, where we don't have all this above ground pump and treat systems, piping and tanks, etc. But instead we install systems within the ground that either treat the groundwater or create an environment for the groundwater to, the contaminants in groundwater to degrade naturally. This is an example of a permeable reactive barrier where the plume would migrate through this barrier. The barrier has some type of reagent in it that treats the contaminants, and so theoretically on the downside of the barrier to the right, that treated water has removed the contaminants. Obviously this is an idealized cross-section, but this is the concept. And there are many variations on this, putting in multiple wells and other approaches that do the same thing. Try to treat the aquifer in place so that we don't have to pump water outside and deal with it externally, but let it deal with it in the ground. And some of these systems have been very, very effective at reducing contaminant levels to more acceptable concentrations. So as I mentioned, the historical activities involving underground storage tanks, I think after a number of years of installing pump and treat systems and product removal systems at tank sites, the states, who often were paying for these systems by using trust funds that were funded by generally industry, realized that they could not clean up these aquifers to the levels that they initially had hoped. So the concept of risk-based corrective action, Rebecca, has come into being, and I would say now is probably a well-accepted concept that essentially says we cannot afford to clean up all aquifers to pristine or background conditions or to drinking water standards, but let's clean them up to a point where there is no unacceptable risk to groundwater use or surface water streams or vapor or whatever. So the fact that we have not done a good job of cleaning up contaminated groundwater has led us to this Rebecca approach, but I think it's a practical approach. It makes sense. And as we'll talk, it is very appropriate in many settings, especially in urban settings where their environmental receptors are few. So to sum up, we have historically presumed that groundwater should all be suitable for potable purposes. I think we now realize that that might be a lofty goal that cannot be attained on many sites. We've acknowledged that groundwater issues will drive most cleanups, and that we have historically done a poor job of being able to attain those very restrictive cleanup goals that we had initially envisioned. We also know that the time and costs associated with cleaning up sites are much longer than we could have imagined. I talked about some of these sites that have had pump and treat systems for decades, and unless you're a federal agency or staying on a piece of property forever, these timeframes are simply not tenable, not acceptable, especially within the concept of a real estate transaction where someone wants to buy some property and wants the cleanup done in some reasonable amount of time so that they can remove that liability from the property. So,
has there ever been a property that you know of that has actually remediated, the groundwater to, perfection, or?
Right. There have been some. I was actually looking through the literature, and I haven't seen any firm statistics, but I think generally probably less than 10 or 15% of the sites that where cleanup is attempted are actually able to get to the stringent cleanup goals that originally we thought we would get to on all properties. We simply cannot get there within reasonable time and reasonable cost.
And it probably depends on what the
contaminants are and the sensitivity of the area. If a plume is located near a public supply well that could be threatened, then extensive resources will be spent to clean up that plume. But if there's no sensitive receptor, then you can justify cleaning up to an alternate, less restrictive level. So just a few of the risk-based options that are in common use, especially in Texas. The most common that we like to use is what we call a low-yield aquifer or Class 3 aquifer setting. This is a recognition that in many of the clays that make up the shallow soils in North Texas, they do not yield large amounts of water to wells, and therefore that groundwater has no real beneficial use. If we can demonstrate that and the state accepts that, they allow us to relax the cleanup levels by a factor of 100, which is a very significant relaxation. So we love the low yield aquifer approach. If we can get that, if the geology is right and we can make that demonstration, that is absolutely one of the first things we look at. Second mechanism is called monitored natural attenuation, where we recognize that there's a plume, but that Mother Nature over some period of time will attenuate or remediate that plume on her own, whereas microorganisms in the aquifer will degrade some of these organic compounds naturally. It takes a long period of time, but it does occur. We've seen it on hundreds and hundreds of properties. And so if monitored natural attenuation is occurring at your site, if the conditions are right, that can be a tool that can be used where you can just let Mother Nature do it. If you have the time and can wait it out, it's a cost-effective approach to letting an aquifer clean up over a long period of time. The third approach under the state's rules is called a plume management zone, which is similar to MNA, but it is essentially a designated area where we acknowledge that we have contamination above the cleanup levels. We demonstrate that that plume is not migrating any further, and do continual monitoring just to show that that plume is not migrating. And the state will allow this, and you would put a deed restriction on that plume zone so that no one used the water, and demonstrate that it doesn't affect off-site parties. And a PMZ can be an effective way to address a plume that, again, we may not have the resources to do a complete remediation of. So this discussion leads into what we think is one of the preferred and most efficient ways to deal with urban contamination, especially in North Texas, but also in many other areas of Texas where shallow groundwater is not used. Urban areas in particular have often had a long history of industrial use, historical cleaners, printers, gas stations, industrial activities have left a legacy of groundwater contamination. The polluter is long gone, the property has changed hands many times, but the contamination remains. In most urban areas, water supplies are obtained from either surface water reservoirs or from very deep aquifers, which are unaffected by this shallow contamination. So we find that urban groundwater contamination often will not affect potable water uses. And if we can show that an area, that contamination in place will not really affect any groundwater resources, then it makes sense to not have to clean it up to that strict source. And this is where the concept of a municipal setting designation comes into being.
So I'm sure when you get the results back from the test and they says, yeah, your groundwater is contaminated, is it the banks that are the banks are the ones that are kind of going, do they like, hey, we're out at that point, or are they aware of, hey, there's some things we can do to?
Right.
I'm sure it's-
Banks are typically, as I'm sure most of the listeners know, risk averse, and they are not interested in picking up a property that has an environmental liability unless it can be very, very well quantified, which is difficult to do. But I think if they know that there is a process in place where a closure through a state agency can be obtained in a reasonable amount of time, then we have found that they are willing to either stick it out or allow for some type of escrow clause to be implemented as part of the real estate transaction to let the deal go forward. So it's a very bank dependent thing. Smaller banks are more risk averse because they may not have internal environmental staff. The larger banks, national banks, will have their own environmental consultants in-house who can advise on the risk, and they may be able to do some more.
And I say banks, but there's a lot of good companies out there that are worried about their liability as well. So,
Yeah.
Okay. So, but if this wasn't available, how long would it take to clean up a ground like that site right there? How long would it take to clean up the groundwater if that was the case?
Yeah, even an active remediation system could take 10 years, and a passive system using monitored natural attenuation could take 20 or 30 years. It's just very long periods of time, which when we say this to clients, they just roll their eyes, just simply not the time frames that they consider acceptable at all.
Correct. Okay.
And with this, I think Clay is going to carry on with some of the other details that he deals with when he's working on MSDs, and he's going to work through some of the process here.
Oh, I forgot he was here. Hey, Clay.
All right. Thanks, Frank. So the concept of municipal setting designations, or MSDs, was first developed in Ohio in the 90s and was first introduced in Texas in 2003. So here in Texas, MSDs have really only been around for about 15 years. And as Frank mentioned, remediation can be very costly and take many years to clean up. So the purpose of MSDs is to provide a more cost-effective and a quicker way to deal with groundwater contamination. So the result of you get an MSD is you deed record the property. You get a restriction that restricts groundwater for potable purposes.
Okay, so I'm going to recap because I'm a little slow. So the MSD is basically saying that the city or municipality is acknowledging that the groundwater is not in use, or it's not going to be drinkable anyway. So the reason to completely clean that groundwater to drinkable, what's the word I'm looking for? Completely drinkable, contamination free is unfeasible. So that's why they are allowing to say, okay, we will allow you to apply for this MSD because of that, or my
right.
Totally.
So you can get an MSD. You have to go through a process which I'll describe next on the next slide. So to go through the MSD process, there's a number of questions you want to ask before you proceed. So one of them is the site is public water provided to the site and properties within a half-mile of the site? And in most urban cases, especially around here, that is the case. Also, you have to do a well search. You have to identify any wells within a half-mile radius of the site. So the way we do that is usually a database like the Texas Water Development Board. You identify a number of wells. But a lot of times you identify wells, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's an issue. A lot of wells that show up are really old wells, especially in areas like Plano. Might be an old irrigation well that was installed on a farm a long time ago, and now it's been completely redeveloped with commercial buildings or parking lots, and that well is either plugged or been destroyed, but there's just no record of it. So, but we have to do our research on that. Another thing, you need to make sure you have support from the local government. So your city municipalities have to have an MSD city ordinance. Not every city has that, but we've helped a number of cities actually develop their MSD ordinance.
That's probably the hardest part of the whole process.
It is, and it takes the most time. So,
because trying to convince people to say contaminated groundwater is okay.
We're going to leave it in place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what Frank usually does. So if they don't know what it is, he usually send Frank out to
Yeah,
explain
it's hard
it
to
to
doubt
him.
Frank. You know, he's just it's that Boston charm, I think. So,
Let's see here.
so
Actually, go back to the other
Okay.
slide real quick. Oh, so another thing, MSDs, they do have cleanup standards, but they're adjusted, so they're significantly higher than the ingestion PCLs, which allows you to leave contamination in place. But I'll describe that in a little bit later in another slide. So once you determine you're eligible for an MSD, you have to go through the MSD application process. So there's an MSD application that has to be developed, which is basically a technical report. Every city that has one has their own general form, but the basic information is the same. So you have to detail the chemicals of concern that are in the groundwater, the concentrations, the stability of the plume, a number of other things. You have to get a survey of the property. Then once you do that, you submit the application to the city. And again, every city is different, but generally you'll submit the reports, and someone in their environmental or engineering department will review it, make sure it's complete. And then once that's done, then they set up a public meeting. So the public meeting is for a general public to come and ask questions, and if they have any concerns regarding the MSD. And again, usually Frank will go and have a presentation and answer any questions that concerned citizens may have. And then once from there, it goes to the city council for approval. So if everything's good, the city council will approve the MSD ordinance. So next step there is water well notices. So there's another well search you have to do for all water wells within 5 miles. So once you do that, you have to submit notifications to all well owners. And again, a lot of the wells that pop up on the database, many of them have been plugged or destroyed, or there's just no record of them. So the process is to make three attempts to notify water well owners. Generally, we get a response back on the first try, but a lot of times we have to end up sending three notices. But again, since a lot of the wells have been destroyed, it may have been a well on a farm, and now that's been developed with commercial properties. So a lot of times you just don't get a response. But once you've made 3 attempts, you're done there and you've satisfied the requirements.
Okay, so you said 3 attempts. So 3 attempts to get
by
a
certified mail.
response.
Yeah, you just send a letter notifying potential well owners of the MSD.
Okay.
So after that, the hard work is done. That takes the most time. So after that, the next step is to do another application to the TCQ. And it's very similar to the city application. Again, it's a different form, but the information is generally the same. And you have to submit that with proof of the well notifications to the TCQ. And once you do that, they'll review it. Generally, they take 60 days or so to review it. And if they agree with everything, if they don't have any comments, they will certify the MSD, and you'll get a MSD certificate for the property.
Okay, so let's talk about, just for a second, what have been some of the hurdles that you've had to come across? Because you've done a lot of them. So you've probably done, what, 30? How many have you guys done?
As a firm, we've done over 30.
Okay.
Yeah, in about 15 different cities. Mm-hmm.
So what are the things that when they come up that people can expect? Okay, this is going to come up. Anything, or is every one of them new and exciting?
Well, the greatest concerns always happen from the adjacent property owners, especially if a plume of contamination has migrated across the boundary onto their property. Their property may not be included within the boundaries of the MSD, but now they have contamination on it. Now, the state of Texas typically will not go after that plume that's, let's say, escaped the MSD boundary, because you've done all the work to show that there's no risk. And so they'll accept that no further action is required. But it still is concerning to offsite property owners that there's a plume on their property that they know about and is there, and how does that affect their the value of their land, etc. And those are handled on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes those property owners will seek their own closure. Sometimes they don't do anything. Sometimes they apply for an innocent owner certificate from the polluting property to give them a release of liability, which is a whole nother program, but it's very appropriate and useful in these circumstances. So those are the main constituents or stakeholders that seem to have problems, is the nearest down gradient property owners. But we also get some very weird questions and comments from the public when we have a public meeting, because just the concept of groundwater itself, the concept of wells, the concept of the geology is something that the average citizen is not familiar with, and therefore you have to be very careful to explain it in basic language so that they can go away feeling comfortable that they know what's going on.
And just to back up, so you're not, when you get an MSD for you're not only doing it for your property, you can do multiple properties around. I mean, it could be like, hey, your property is on this block, but we're going to set the MSD for the entire block.
You could include the properties as long as those landowners wanted to participate, and that's what we prefer to do sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't happen, but that's preferable just so you can get the entire plume encased within the boundary of the MSD, and therefore no one is left out. There's no residual properties that feel
it only,
not included.
I would imagine it only benefits everybody on that block.
Benefits, but sometimes there's fear of the unknown. What does this mean? If I have an MSD on my property, does that affect its value in the future? That someone's going to say, why do you have this? And it opens up a can of worms. So there's lots of different individual arguments, pro and against.
So you say that this is the best solution here. This is the most preferred best solution. Why is that? Why?
Right. I think as we get to the last few slides,
good.
We'll get to it.
Okay, here's a chart.
There you go.
Okay, so here's a chart that shows the cleanup standards for the ingestion PCL, or the drinking water standard, versus the MSD adjusted PCL. So like for benzene, the ingestion PCL would be 0.005 milligrams per liter, where the MSD adjusted PCL would be 180 milligrams per liter. So that just shows to show you how much easier it is to close the site using an MSD. And you can see the other concentrations there. And then if you go down to like lead and arsenic, you'll see that it says, basically not applicable. So lead and arsenic aren't volatile, so you don't have to worry about those in the MSD.
Okay.
So the benefits of an MSD. So it's reduced delineation. Obviously, you have much higher cleanup standards and less delineation. A lot of times, if you're closing it to ingestion PCL, you have to put in a lot more monitoring wells to delineate the plume, and that can just become much more costly. And another thing to consider is you get relaxed soil cleanup levels, which we haven't talked about that yet. So again, as you can see here, the groundwater protective PCLs are much lower than the MSD adjusted PCLs for soil.
Okay, so let's not talk geologists. Talk to me like I own this property. What does that mean? Don't laugh at me.
So basically, it allows you. Let's say you have some impacted soil at a dry cleaner. If it's below the concrete and it's below the MSD adjusted PCLs, you're allowed to leave that soil in place. Whereas if you're not getting an MSD and it exceeds the groundwater protective concentrations, you would have to excavate that soil.
So the MSD not only covers the groundwater, it also protects the contents of the soil?
Yes, it allows you to leave certain concentrations in the soil, correct?
Most MSD sites will go from what would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars of remediation to essentially no remediation. And so that's significant, especially on a developed site where there's contamination below a structure, for example, which can be very expensive to remove contaminated soil or to treat contaminated groundwater. So the benefits are just, in my experience, my 40 years, enormous. And they're all defensible. They all make sense. They're all protective of human health and the environment. It's really a tremendous program that we think is the most useful one that we have in our arsenal to address urban contamination.
So I think Frank touched on this earlier. So most of the cities around here are supplied water from our surface lakes, our surface reservoirs, and any potable water wells are generally greater than 1,000 feet deep. So most of the contamination in North Texas is generally perched aquifer. For example, here in Plano area, the Austin Chalk may be 10 feet deep. So you have really an unusable perched aquifer where the usable aquifers are separated by potentially thousands of feet of bedrock.
So we did get a question from our audience. How about ecological exposures in the Gulf Coast? Are those affected? I don't even understand that question, so I'm relying on you guys. So the question is, how about ecological exposures in the Gulf Coast? Are those effective?
Right. I think maybe one of the last slides we talk about this. The MSD is not a panacea to all exposure routes, as we'll discuss. It really focuses on the groundwater ingestion route. That is the ingestion of groundwater. And so therefore, if you go for a site closure, you still need to look at impacts on vapor and impacts on surface water receptors. So if you have a site that's adjacent to the Gulf Coast where you have a discharge into a tidal estuary or into the bay, that exposure route is not solved by the presence of an MSD. You would still need to do the ecological assessment to show that exposure route is acceptable. And in fact, that exposure route might trump the MSD and require some type of cleanup or response action that an MSD would not address. So it's a good question. This does not address every single exposure route, just the potable ingestion exposure route, which in many sites is it's a principal one. But on coastal sites or sites near surface water bodies, absolutely need to look at that discharge. This is just a schematic of the typical geology in North Texas. The vertical scale on this is about a half a mile over 3,000 feet. You'll see the uppermost layer is alluvium, and maybe the upper 20 to 50 feet. That is the layer, that very thin orange layer at the top is the layer in which 95% of the contamination that we find is located. And underneath that are relatively impervious rock stratums, the Austin Chalk and the Eagle Ford Shale, which are hundreds of feet deep before we hit a minor aquifer, the Woodbine. And then there's some more impervious layers, the Washita and the Fredericksburg, before we hit the next water-bearing zone, the Paluxy, that second blue area, etc. So you can see that we have hundreds and hundreds of feet of impervious aquiclude, as we call it, that protects those deeper water-bearing zones from the surface contamination. So the geology in particular in North Texas and in many other parts of the state is ideal for application of an MSD because we have natural protective zones that protect the deeper water-bearing units. We're going to just discuss one brief case study. This is a very typical site, a shopping center in Dallas that had a dry cleaner for many, many years. The site was owned by a nonprofit organization and was able to get some funds from the EPA's Brownfield Site, actually from the state's Brownfield Site Assessment Group. We found the chlorinated solvents PCE, which is tetrachloroethylene, and the daughter products TCE and DCE in groundwater, and a plume had migrated away from this dry cleaner and across the parking lot and was possibly going off-site. So this is one of the earlier MSDs, and the solution was clear to us when we saw the data. Here's a schematic of the dry cleaner. You can see that the plume had migrated beyond the boundaries of the site. It was not fully delineated off-site, which was the street. And so we had an issue here, but with the MSD, we did not need to complete the full delineation because once the MSD was approved, then we no longer exceeded any cleanup level, MSD adjusted cleanup level anywhere on the property. So this was very beneficial. Number one, because it was a nonprofit organization. Number two, a lot of the work was able to be done under a grant from both the state and the EPA. And we're able to get this site closed with almost no cost to the nonprofit, which made us all feel pretty good because the dry cleaner was historical and not operated by them. So it was a very great success story that was able to keep this shopping center operating without any further environmental liability. This is just another table showing some of the benefits of this particular case. If you go down to the table, you can see that we had groundwater concentrations of PCE and TCE well above the PCL without an MSD. But when you compare them to the MSD adjusted PCLs in the far right column, we were well below those standards. So the site closed with no further action, and they were able to move on. So a few summary slides. The benefits of an MSD are clearly reduced cleanup for contaminated groundwater. We haven't talked about the cost for groundwater cleanup, but you can imagine it's very easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, even for the simplest of groundwater cleanup sites. It also eliminates the need for plume chasing, going off site to put wells on third-party properties to delineate the plume to low levels. Reduces groundwater monitoring, and it reduces the cleanup standards for soil. But one of the best benefits of an MSD is we have done so many now, and we know the systems, the cities and the state are familiar with the process. We now can give a fairly predictable closure strategy. We can estimate a time frame for the closure, and we're able to estimate the cost for the closure with a fair amount of certainty, and that is of great value to our clients, especially in real estate transactions where money might go into escrow. So as environmental contamination goes, to be able to put a time frame and a cost with a high degree of confidence on a project is a real benefit, and we appreciate the fact that the MSD allows us to do that.
So I have a question, and then we have a question from one of our listeners. So the MSD, that sticks with that property or that zone forever?
It runs with the deed for the property, yes.
Okay, is it ever reopened, or do they ever come back and say, we might have made a mistake on this?
Well, it hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
But it is a city ordinance, and cities can remove ordinances. So it's like anything. Anything can happen. So a city could decide that for some reason, that they didn't want this ordinance any longer, though. I can't imagine why they would do that after going through this process, but I'm told that is a possibility because it's a city ordinance and it could be voted on if some extenuating circumstances arose in the future.
That would be a rough decision. Because then it could be
some new information came to light, or the plume extended, okay, and they didn't like it. Right?
Okay, so this is a question from one of our listeners. For sites in Dallas, what's the typical turnaround time and costs associated with obtaining the MSD?
The city of Dallas has a process that their goal is to approve an MSD within 5 to 6 months, typically. And then the MSD goes to the state of Texas, which will probably take another 3 to 4 months. So you're out at about a year before you could get it. If there are any hiccups in the process and in terms of the application, if there are any back and forth where there are incomplete information within the application, that can delay it another 2 to 3 months because you need to go back and forth with either the city or the state. So we typically tell people to plan on 12 to 15 months for an MSD, for a city and state MSD in Dallas. And the costs, ballpark numbers would be about, in at least for us, about $30,000 for consulting fees and probably about $12,000 to $14,000 in city and state application fees.
Okay, so I have one more question too. So let's say that I have a property and I got an MSD and I'm selling the property to somebody else. Would there ever be a need to do, I mean, maybe obviously a phase one, but would there ever be a need to do a phase two now that I have that MSD, or is that, sorry.
Yeah. Only in the situation where you had continuing industrial activities and you suspected a possible additional release.
Something different.
Just something different, right. But if the activities were the same and there's no indications of a release, then I could argue further phase two would be unnecessary. But that's more of a judgment call.
It's pretty big too. I mean, so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I guess we're going to the next slide. The challenges.
Right. Yeah. So MSD is a great program. There are challenges. You need to be prepared for them. Number one, you probably would have a hard time thinking of environmental cleanups that involve the public or even the cities. Usually environmental cleanups are dealt with through the state agencies. The MSD will involve close interaction with the city, and with the public, because there will be a public meeting where typically property owners within a half a mile are invited to attend. So there is a public component that we typically don't have to deal with, and we need to be prepared to explain complex environmental issues, contamination issues to the public. That can be a challenge, and we need to spend a lot of time preparing for that and making sure that we're clear about what the risks are and are not. The second challenge is sometimes if you are near an area where there are retail public utilities, that is companies that have water that they sell for potable purposes, they will need to provide written support in most jurisdictions in the state of Texas. So you need to convince water companies that your contamination will not affect their well. Third, MSDs do not include offsite properties unless you explicitly include them when you make the application. So if you do have offsite properties that are not included, you may want to consider that, maybe try to bring them into the fold to make everyone comfortable that the MSD has encompassed the entire plume. If there is a potable water well within a half a mile that could be at risk, the state can require some type of response action or preventative action to make sure that that well will not be harmed in the future. That is typically not the case in the urban areas in North Texas, but in some outlying areas and in more rural locations, that is a very real possibility and should be looked at early in the game. And finally, the issue of vapor intrusion, which has become a much hotter topic over the last few years, is not addressed, at least now, in the MSD. But you should work with your consultant and talk about if there are any vapor issues from leaving contamination in place that could impact either your property or offsite properties, and be prepared to deal with them. And we've done other webinars on vapor, and we probably will in the future. That's a whole nother topic and is a hot one in the environmental field these days.
So you talked about Dallas, the cost and time in Dallas. Is it different from city to city, or are they pretty much the same, or?
I would say
cost and time, I guess.
Other cities are quicker than Dallas. Dallas is a very thorough review process, and they're very proud of it. And they're one of the cities that do the most MSDs. But I would say we have had others in other cities that have gone faster, just because the cities are smaller. The number of staff reviewing are fewer, and they've been a little bit quicker.
So if you've been to a city that has, let's say not Dallas, but let's say another city in the surrounding metroplex that you've already done one before, is it any faster because you don't have to go through that whole convincing them process, if you will? Or is it pretty much the same?
Probably not, because they want to be very careful to solicit input from all of the various city departments. And so we think that they all take their time to make sure that this is, since it is a public process, we want to make sure that everyone that is a stakeholder has an opportunity. So it cannot be shortened too much. The cities are very sensitive to that.
No, I'm not just talking about the process. I'm talking about like if there's a city out there that doesn't have that ordinance at all.
Oh,
Let's say like Grand Prairie, they have
they have
the
an
imminent
ordinance.
the ordinance, right? So if you went into a Grand Prairie today, it's not like you're going to have to walk in and try to convince them that this is a good idea. So that's kind of the time frame I was thinking of. So
That's right. Yeah.
So, but with that, if you go into a city that doesn't have that ordinance, is there extra time that it
Yeah, there is. You often need to have, and we've done this on 3 or 4 cities, is meet with the city council or the city manager and explain to them the benefit of an MSD to bringing underused sites back into productive use. And often that will take 3 to 5 months to go through and for them to talk to the internal council and city council members to decide if an MSD is right for them.
Great. So I'm going to open the questions for our audience before we wrap this up. But here's a good question. Somebody wrote in: what percentage of groundwater impacted sites do you think can be successfully closed in less than 5 years? What percentage of groundwater impacted do you think can be successfully closed in less than 5 years? Maybe they're talking about just.
I mean, without an MSD, I'm
Maybe,
guessing.
yeah.
Right? Yeah. Wow. I would say it would be less than 50%, top of my head.
And it would also depend on
Depends on a lot.
on what it would be.
Yeah,
so.
but it's natural groundwater contamination is slow just because groundwater movement is relatively slow.
Okay, here's one more. Are there green chemicals that you can use to do groundwater remediation?
Sure. A lot of the chemicals that are used for what I call enhanced natural attenuation are green chemicals. We did a project in Houston where I don't know if you call it a green chemical, but we injected cheese whey, a natural product. It was an edible cheese whey, but not the stuff you would eat, but it's kind of a byproduct.
It's the byproduct of making cheese.
Making cheese.
I knew that because I lived in Wisconsin for a while.
And we actually had a project that was near a cheese plant, and they basically delivered their cheese whey to our remediation site for just the cost of trucking. The product was free because they were going to have to dispose of it and pay to dispose of it. And we injected the cheese whey into multiple wells on 6 or 7 occasions. And it was very successful in reducing contaminant levels. Another compound that's used often is molasses has been used because it has electron donors that will cause natural degradation. So there are many natural products or innocuous products that can be injected to clean up aquifers, and those are just 2 that I'm familiar with. And
Interesting.
There are many others, I'm sure.
I do know that if you use molasses, that can get you into some sticky situations.
Yeah. I will say the cheese whey wells were not pleasant to sample.
Yeah, I tell you what, I when I heard that before, I've never been able to read Little Miss Muffet the same ever again. So, okay, well, we're going to close it out. If you guys have any other questions, actually, you can email them to us, and we'll be more than happy to answer them back, and or any other experiences that you may have. Here's Frank and Clay's contact information. You can give them a call or email back. So, guys, thank you so much. Very interesting conversation. So, thanks for joining us, and we'll try to get you back here early in the spring for what did we say that we were going to do? Oh, shoot.
Probably vapor, I don't know.
No, probably no. We talked about it. I was like, ghost tanks.
Okay.
We might have to. I'm just kidding, but that would be probably a rather quick one. So, we will be. We have this recorded, and we'll be getting this out probably tomorrow morning. I'll send you an email with the link, and we will provide the slides to download as well. You guys have a great week. Talk to you soon.